My name is Chloe Eastup. I'm a fellow in the Global Language Justice Project here, like you all have been hearing all day. I heard about Marissa's work at a party, so it's fitting that we all have wine and food and are at a party right now, pretending like we're in a building in Murray Hill, which is where I was. So Marissa Johnson-Valenzuela is a multi-genre artist who was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas, though she's also paid some sort of rent in Lawrence, Detroit, DC, Laramie, Havana, and the Mexican state of Chiapas. Philadelphia has mostly been her home since 2000. Her work has been supported by the work of many rad people and projects, and she is part of Rhythm Collective, an artist collaboration with Cynthia Dewey Oka and Area D. Matthews. Marissa is the founder of Thread Makes Blanket Press and is a full-time faculty member and union organizer at Community College of Philadelphia. So let's please welcome Marissa Johnson-Valenzuela.
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, as you can probably tell from my bio, the sort of experiences, I think, create identity in a large part, and so much of my, where I'm coming from, which we'll talk about here in a second, is based on those experiences that I've had throughout my life. What you have in front of you, just to give you a heads up, is the liner notes zine that goes along with my album, which is here. If you're super geeked out, you can buy it on vinyl, or there's t-shirts and bandanas. But you don't have to do that. But you're going to hear a little bit of it, and then there's some of these to go around for everybody, so please take one. And if you turn to the front cover, you will see a download code to get the whole album. So I hope you like it. And then a really long thank you list that, of course, is not exhaustive, but then also centers location, right, towards the end, which we'll talk more about in a second. And so I'm going to start by sort of kind of giving an overview of the project. First, I want to show you a video that I think centers it pretty well, and then try to connect to all the really awesome things that I've been listening to and hearing throughout this symposium. And thank you so much to Chloe for being up for this. And I wasn't sure if you were going to be honest about how we don't know each other. But Chloe heard about this project through my producer, who she met at a party over Christmas, and then we communicated. And I'm just honored to be here, and I think there's a lot of really interesting intersections with what other folks have been talking about, and so thank you. So this first music video is a video for one of the first songs that we created, and just to give you a little bit of background of this project, and you can almost even tell from the thank you notes. What happened was Anthony Romero, who's a professor at Tufts University in the art department, and had lived in Philadelphia and had worked at Temple, and I worked on a project with him, and we just kind of vibed. And then he moved up to Boston, worked at Tufts, and got research money to put out a series of records. He knew me pretty well. He knew that I had been a DJ since about 2000, and was a super geek for music and all the politics. And he got research money to put out a series of records that were sort of at some intersection between politics and music. And so he asked me, will you put out a record? I have an MFA in creative writing and fiction. I teach at Community College of Philadelphia. I was like, of course you say yes when somebody says, do you want to make a record? So even though I'm working on a novel, and that took a short pause for what I thought was going to be a few months project that ended up being a year-long project, as it just grew and grew. So Anthony Romero really was the catalyst for this. Having somebody, it reminds me of a friend of mine who was a social worker and did this experimental project where he got to ask people with severe mental health issues, if you had no borders or boundaries, what would you do with your life, right? And that's sort of how I felt, and it was this weird thing that was then funded, and people got to put money wherever they wanted to, which I really just love that as a way to deal with sort of mental health and getting people to take agency over their whole lives. And so I feel like that's always kind of what I'm going to in my life, if that makes sense. I don't know, maybe that's a little too woo-woo. So that was sort of what I think Anthony did for me, was to be here's some funding, do this magic thing. Nobody cares what it sounds like except for you. but I care very deeply, right, about what it sounds like and what that was going to be used for, but I also care very deeply about a lot of the projects. So that are a lot of the ideas and the themes and the things. So the main thing that I decided I didn't need another project in my life. I deal with a lot of these issues, both in professional work and creative work. And so I decided to, based on time that I had been a professor of Chicano studies, based on my own personal identity as having a Mexican mother and a white father, and based on, the sort of contemporary American moment, if you will, I wanted to make an album that argued that the United States and Mexico are one country with a so-called border that justifies oppression, right? Because that's something music and art can do, right? We don't live in that reality. The border is very real, right, in many ways. But people also transcend it every day, right, and ignore it, right, and refuse it, right? And so I was really interested in investigating that and celebrating that. What happened over the course of the year, the production of this album, which again took much longer than I imagined. It was supposed to be like a little EP. It grew into a full length with like a very, I think, clear narrative arc. Was that the United States found itself in a very heightened shit space of the U.S.-Mexico border, right? For lack of a better term. I don't know, what do you just shit, right? And it's always been shit, right? It's always been complicated, right? That's actually the history I was centering this project on. But I think it has been arguably heightened. And so when I started this project, it was very important for me to have some sense of, I think there's a strong beauty in joy as resistance, right? And that, if everything's miserable, then the miserable people win, right? But at the same time, with what happened over the course of this year, in terms of, I'm going to assume, and maybe that's wrong, that I don't need to tell people in the room what's been happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, right? But in this sort of heightened rhetoric and the heightened realities of the denial of human rights and the caging of people and the taking away of children from their parents, and the loss of children, right? They can't find, I just saw something today where they've been monitoring everybody who's been protesting family separations, but yet they still can't, and so they know everybody who's been protesting, but yet they've misplaced 600 children, right? Or more, right? And those numbers are tricky and I think part of this ongoing conversation. But anyhow, so over the course of that year, I had been very intentional in the original sort of thoughts behind this album. And then over the course of that year, and especially as we were finishing, which is when we were finishing up the album as the child separations were really, really in the news daily and horrific, and continue to be. And it became this thing where I was like, is this album depressing enough? Right? Because it had been more depressing than I intended, but then I was like, fuck, do we even need side B, in which I try to do a little bit more towards what we're fighting for, the potential that we have, as humans, if you will. Whatever. Anyhow, so all of that is to sort of introduce this, which is one of my favorite things about this album and this project is, and this is something I think we are talking about, is of sort of language and identity and autonomy. And so one of the things that music allowed me to do that in many ways my writing doesn't allow me to do in the same way is to be in collaboration with other folks, right? And so this song in particular, in this music video, a brother and sister duo, Sheila and Jose Quintana, who are undocumented, did the music video. I actually wasn't there for it. It's great. I'm not in it. And then also Kisio, who is the main rapper. You'll hear me a little bit, but Kisio is featured in this track, is also undocumented, and he's an undocumented chef in Philadelphia. And one of the things, again, from the beginning of the project, there was this idea of the United States border U.S.-Mexico border doesn't exist in the ways that we are taught that it does, if you will. And then also, the other main thing that I wanted to do was center it in place, right? And so I'm coming from Philadelphia, very far from the border, and I'm actually originally from Wichita, Kansas. And you'll see in the second music video, if we get there, that I center a lot of Midwest Mexican imagery, because that's very much what I was raised with, which is very different from the coastal images of Latinos, right? But also not. But it's also very ranchero. It's like, anyway, so it's very much more Mexican in some ways. Anyhow, but so I wanted to center it in both of those places because those are my experiences. And one of the things that I've seen in Philadelphia, being there since 2000, is, when I first arrived, there was really no significant Mexican-American community. You'd have to go to Kennett Square and hang out with the mushroom pickers, which there was a longer history there of Mexicans living there. But over the course of the almost 20 years, we've really seen Mexicans just take over every kitchen in Philadelphia, like, to be a little blunt, and probably every drywall company as well. And I don't mean that like sort of flippant, though it sounds that way a little. And as somebody who used to do social work in Philadelphia, I would work a lot with Puerto Ricans because they were like, Latino enough, right? And so we'd be paired. A lot of Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia had no clue of like the rest of the country in many ways of the United States, and they would be like, oh, there's so many more Puerto Ricans than there are Mexicans, and I was like, about that. Anyway, and so it's been really interesting to watch that shift in Philadelphia, right? In the ways that like the consciousness just wasn't there, the narrative has had to shift, right, as people have come in and created a space. And this is actually the Italian market, and then I'll play this, all of that was to preface this. And the Italian market, I joke that it didn't have to change the colors, because it's very much become the Mexican market. And they're like jutted right up against each other, but they, the flag order maybe needs to change. But otherwise, it's actually quite lovely, and has been just interesting to watch Philadelphia navigate that. And then the other thing that's referenced right at the beginning, which I think was also important, is talking about Philadelphia, is the move bombing, where in the 80s, and I'm going to forget the year, does anybody remember who's in the room? 1980 something, 85, 84, 86. The United States, sure. But Philadelphia bombed itself. It dropped a bomb from a helicopter on the MOVE organization, which would be a black radical separatist organization, and maybe that's not the most accurate label, but you kind of get the sense, right? So Philadelphia bombed itself, and I also wanted to note that, right? Because this is not a place that only has an Italian and Mexican identity. It has many, many identities, right, in Philadelphia. So you'll get that. Too much inspo. Here you go.
Here in Philadelphia, the city that bombed itself. In almost every kitchen, there are Mexicans working, making food, cleaning dishes, serving, public hunger, and public filling. We are what we eat.
Ni siquiera tengo título. El arte de la comida me convierte en un discípulo. Me encargo de hornear a una pasta parmellano, retano. Llámame José Cacho, su cacho Pepe. Yo soy máximo, máximo, máximo en el máximo del micrófono. Soy máximo. Ya tengo una tortilla en el aire. Ya lleva mi gente que sigue surcando la tierra, sigue soltando raíces, sigue cruzando fronteras, sigue tirando las visas, sus pasaportes. Somos seres humanos y no somos ilegales en la escala y todavía lo traspasan. Traspasan los transgénicos, la vida para el frente, controlando el machete. Eso no es de uno, es de millones de gente. En la quinta bailando ese compás que se sienta bien cabrón, que se sienta el latino, porque no están separados, porque estamos más unidos, porque somos los hispanos, porque estamos divididos. No somos latinos, latinoamericanos que se sientan divididos. Esa tierra es de mexicas, oltecas, mayas, pichones, chiles, tortillas, sal, frijoles. Lo digo en Luca y lo digo yo. Estas son las cosas que salen del corazón, bro.
to point this out. I mean, it's here as well, but because this is just a detail that I think is worth mentioning before I forget. This album image is by the artist Trevor Paglin, who does a bunch of surveillance art. And so that's actually the US-Mexico border near Nogales, and is seen through the US military computer algorithm that monitors the border for movement. So that's what the green stuff is the computer looking for things that move, for human beings. So it's, you know, it's this beautiful image. I saw it actually in Mexico City, and then was able to get permission to use it. And yeah, so that's Kisio is on there. I think one of the things I want to say too about that is how he sort of shouts out indigenous communities. And I think that that's something that I also try to be aware of, right? When you're saying that one border doesn't exist, then you kind of start to wonder where do you erase all the borders, right? And that all of these borders of these countries, these nation states, as folks talked about earlier, have like been kind of like put on top of peoples who are already here, right? And so really honoring that. There's a track on the album, which I can play in a second, that tries to do that, and which I am not on, and it's just Native or indigenous women speaking, and that felt really important to me, to give space on the album, and that was kind of the things that a project like this can do. And so, I'm sorry, I'm like kind of like, and the album, which I'm going to give you a little bit more of here in a second, there's like the sampler video that'll kind of give you a bigger arc of it, is in Spanish, English primarily, with Spanish, and then what I call Spanglish, which is my broken Spanish. It's usually me. Because, you know, for my own history, I did not learn Spanish in the home. Again, my mother's Mexican-American, my dad's white, and as people were talking about earlier, it was very much an intentional thing on the part of the family to not bring Spanish along, right, in terms of access and in terms of assimilation. There's a part in the album, I think I can even point to this lyrics, although there aren't page numbers because, boy, it's a zine, in which I talk about that, and in which I just kind of want to put that on the table, because I know there's folks who speak, at least one person who I actually personally know, who speak better Spanish than me in the room, and I'm all for that. But I'm also like, so what I kind of decided to do, it's on Tambores de Orgullo, it's the one with like the prison image towards the middle. And so I talk about, I say, mi español no es perfecto, pero it's a sound of assimilation, of a family's forced disintegration, and the sound of how my mother, unable to do so for herself, tried to protect us, right? And then I also talk about that because I think it was important for me to include my perspective and my own sort of like personal politics in this project, which, you know, is both trying to do this like grandiose thing and is of course, like any project, horribly inadequate. I talk about my pride and how it's responsibility, but it's also a question, it's my response to a question I've been asked my whole life, which I've been asked many, many times, like, what are you? And I joke, and I mean no harm to anybody in the room, I joke often that it's like ambiguously ethnic. You know, and so in Turkey they thought I was Turkish, you know, when my mother was in Hawaii they thought she was Hawaiian, you know, and even though she's Mexican, it's this fluidity that many Latinx folks exist in, which I think, you know, kind of going back to some of the questions earlier, and I'm just sort of rambling, but I will go forward. I think that in my history of teaching Chicano studies, I think that in living in Philadelphia, which is very much in a black-white binary, I think that Latinx identity really kind of shows us, exposes the construction, or can expose the construction of sort of racial identities and purity and authenticity, which are just complicated, and maybe they do exist. I was thinking about this earlier. Sorry, I'm going to put these up on the board. And so this, earlier from y'all's presentation, right, some search terms, right, and all of these terms, and I was like, oh my God, this reminds me so deeply of, like, sort of the fragmentation of language and this attempt to control. I think language is always attempting to control something that can't be controlled, right? Which is experience and identity and humanity, right? And trying to translate it in and of itself, right? And so there's that from earlier today, and then this from just the other day. I was in. Oh, come on! You know you want to. Why not? Okay. From when I was a few days ago, I was asked to present at Common Field, which is art and curator, lefty thing, from what I can gather. You get asked to do things just like this, and I was like, what am I doing? Who am I? Who are you? And so, who's in the room, right? And so this same sort of thing of like problem words, right, and these unfixed sort of identities, but then also these attempts to fix them in terms of dignity, right? In terms of, and I think that and it's a shame she left, because she raised all these important questions about like where do we draw these lines, and what are rights and what are not, and these like legal definitions, and whereas like I'm trying to like operate outside of the state, right? But the state actually does very much matter, and like UN resolutions are a first step towards sort of getting sort of respect and rights, and ultimately I think if we can all have something in common, and again it might be a stretch, is dignity, right? And this idea of and equality is such a murky word too, right? But because how, I don't know. But anyway, sorry, getting a little too into it. But how all of these words mean different things to different people, and that was a lot of what I was circling as well in this project. But I also, to go back a little bit, Chloe, tell me when I'm too weird here. Also to, my computer knows in the way that they do.
I do not speak of death. I speak of a history that lives in each of us.
Are you illegal? American citizen? Are you illegal? Stand for my highest mountain, and before my longest journey, and therefore must I stand deeper than I ever before stand. Just where we are. What I must stand into is to see a human experience. Not about great life, human responsibility. Even common conflict, get next.
Hasta la victoria siempre.
Baby, I know you know. Baby, I know you know. Oh, it's moving. Oh. And full belief in Franza, in camaraderie, exceptionalist ethics, and excellence bonuses for the help.
What does each mean then? Look at that beautiful hand there. Can you?
No. It's not beautiful, but I don't care if I'm not beautiful. I just like to sing from the bottom of my heart. But anyway, this is my religion. I use them because I believe in reincarnation, you know?
A history of fuckery brings us to this fuckery. The separation of a baby from its mother's breast. The savagery is loud in its capital rhythm. A caste system works by design. Drives down wages and rights. Denies dignity. The bucket lines of Mexico City, we have to bury ourselves.
Who helped me make this. Again, collaboration rules. And the rooster is actually a Zapatista rooster, which matters maybe only to me, but I want to tell you about it. Bantam Records is what Anthony decided to name his record label, which is going to have more records come out. And the Zapatistas, I think, you know, I spent a lot of time there over the years. Indigenous rebellion in southwestern Mexico that rose up against the Mexican government in response to NAFTA, among among centuries of repression and isolation. In addition to those, and going there as a pretty young punk was just like world bending and informative for me as to thinking. You know, before then, but then especially with then outside of the state, and so that's always, I think, coming through. You know, there's a line in there that you saw, like the bucket lines of Mexico City. We have to unbury ourselves, very much like in conversation, I think, with Rebecca Solnit and Paradise Built in Hell, talking about how when the state fails us, we actually surprise ourselves by what we're capable of. Maybe that's not always the case, but we need it to be so, right? So thinking about that, and thinking even about Cuba, and like this whole, sorry, I'm looking at my friend Nate, who like went to medical school in Cuba, and how he's like, why are you supporting that? But but you know, and getting to experience Cuba through his lens a little bit more than, you know, as a tourist, though I was still very much so, and just having that be like, oh shit, I didn't realize I was such a capitalist, right? Like in that, like, I'm constantly like, why is this so inefficient? And why is there only one thing on the menu? Even though they hand you a full menu. You know, and so, and a similar, you know, and that was kind of like a callback to, you know, a very different existence that I experienced in Zapatista territory as well. And how that sort of like radical revision that like can really help us, I think, expand what's possible, or it's helped me, you know, at best. And so I think that's a lot of what this album is trying to do, and you know, maybe that's more the subtext and the like overtness of it. I mean, I think on the surface you kind of heard like that was like a bit of a sample of like the sort of narrative arc of the album, starting with tracks such as Recognize, which I don't know if you're gonna get, I don't know, I'm like trying to use this as, or let's go to the Herencia. So after Philly Kitchens, so a couple of pages in, you have this one like, you know, talking about inheritance, and what I do, which is so academic, but I'm such a dork, and it actually reminded me of the chart that you had of the deaths of translators, right? And that the importance of that documentation. What's happening now that didn't happen for many, many years is the documentation, and it's happened in the last like 10, 15 years, is the documentation of the lynchings of Mexicans in early United States, right? And there are multiple reasons for why these were quote unquote lost, and are now more recently sort of discovered. And one of them is that the United States did not know how to label people, and so they were either labeled white or black, right? They didn't have like another option. And also the NAACP had a very strict definition for what counted as a lynching in the way they documented things, and it had to be extrajudicial, right? But in the American Southwest, the sheriff was very often involved, right, or allowed it to happen. Many of these folks were pulled out of the jail, right, the local provincial jail, right, that was not very secure, right, so they were pulled out by the mob and then hanged, right, and so I am mostly just a dork, and so I had checked out 12 books on this without thinking about it for this project, like actually prior to this project, but then when I was looking to like sort of lay some historical foundations for what I explore in the album, this felt really important. And so I really just kind of read these. I think of it as an erasure poem for those who are familiar with that sort of poetry, of sort of like taking bits and pieces to create a separate narrative. And so sort of thinking of that, and then a couple tracks later, and then, you know, talking about that, and you heard that ours is not a dead inheritance, right, that this is a history that lives. And then, you know, the mapping, this idea of like who's looting who, which is, feels like a very important question, right, when we think about like who is being violated. And then there was another, I don't have lyrics for it, which is the one where it's just Native women speaking, which also felt like it's called Recognize, but it is on the album, and it felt like a very important foundational track to sort of acknowledge that, right? I think somebody talked about, I know somebody did, I just can't remember who, talked about how, I'm forgetting your name, Maya, yes. Maya spoke about how like with certain projects you just have to make some like, this is what I'm gonna do because I can't take on everything. And I very much, that resonated for me because I very much had that with this project where I was like, but before nation states, but before the US-Mexico border, right, but the people here, and I was like, but I have to try to narrow it down. And like, what about the United States-Canada border? What about Mexico's border? You know, it's got very complicated histories with Guatemala and Honduras, right? And we see that now, right? We see Mexico repeating the oppressions that the United States has you know, done on the Mexicans. And so, you know, and I think purity is a very rare thing, but that you sometimes need to refine it. But my attempt to acknowledge that was to have these other tracks, to have these other things that sort of like acknowledge that that's there, and sort of have that be part of the foundation for this otherwise fairly particular argument. that, you know, and then I also tried to make people dance, which I don't think you heard as much of that. But that was really important to me. I wanted to make an album that anybody would want to listen to, right? That wasn't just like, in which I could tap into, right, that part of culture, that part of identity, right? That part of solace, right? And so I think that that's a lot of what I hope is happening, I think is happening. To do that, I was very dependent, maybe then I'll just talk. I was very, very dependent, and I'm proudly, in part because of my own identity, right, but like the remix and the sample and the hybrid, right? And so I call it conceptual reggaeton, which like reggaeton is not particularly like Mexican at all, like there is Mexican reggaeton, but it's like primarily like its historical roots are in like Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, among other places, and doing a very inadequate, you know, there are textbooks this big that'll give you a better history than I just did, but that being a lot of what I was listening to, and then bringing in the tuba, which, you know, is a fascinating instrument, and then making that more like the bass beat. And tuba is never in reggaeton, but it's always in like banda and like ranchero music. You know, it's also in polka, right? Like it's so many things. So bringing in the tuba, so that was a lot of what you heard there. And yeah, and then just trying to like figure, and then bringing in sample-based music with samples from like a little bit of everywhere, very much predominantly Latin America, in which I include the United States, but you know, in the way that hip hop is pulling, right, from like all cultures, right, and remixing and you know, can at its best do really interesting work that way. But anyway, I don't know. That's it. I think I just like totally ran through my whole list of things to say. It feels really quick. It might have not felt quick to you, but it did to me.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, I think we can open it up, but just as a few things, sort of trying to tie it back to what we've been talking about. I mean, I think Amy brought up this question of text earlier, and like, is music a text? Does it help us think beyond some of like the constraints of text? You were talking about the remix and the sample, and I think these are really interesting models for how we think citationally, that are not like the palimpsest or the citation or these other things that are like rooted in textual metaphors. So I think that's really fascinating. Also in terms of just thinking about what music can do for, you know, justice projects, or for thinking about identity or purity or authenticity or assimilation. I mean, pero it's the sound of assimilation is like, you could write a dissertation with that sentence. I mean, it's so, like, what is the sound of assimilation, and how does thinking about it sonically help us to understand it better, or to be resistant, or something. I mean, I'm really interested in specific questions like with reggaeton, which you started to touch on at the end. Why reggaeton, other than like it's fun to dance to, or maybe that's all we need. And like also Philadelphia, just in terms of being in New York. And I feel like we get into this kind of idea of like, this is like, New York is everything, right? So like what can Philly, like, Philly's amazing, like what should we, you know about Philly, and like how is it a different model than, because we've been talking all semester about how New York is so linguistically diverse, and which it is, but like how, you know, Philly is diverse in different ways. Really finally, the use in the video of diegetic and non-diegetic sound, where it's like legible in the video as like what is not you and what is you, would not be legible in the, or like audible in the track. So I guess from like everything from like a legal perspective, like how did you pay for any rights? Like, this is my husband's job, is to do like rights in music, so I'm curious. And and then also like, were you in any way like trying to work with, were you trying to signal like, this is me, this is not me, in a way, in the track, in a way that was like more obvious in the video? Feel free to respond to that, or we can take more questions and you can kind of think about
Yeah, no, just some quick, and then like would love to like talk with folks. It's like too bad that you couldn't like watch this and be at the table because I love a common table of things. But yeah, so one of the things I didn't mention that I think is also really important, you know, in like original conceits of the album, right, which is like this idea that the border doesn't exist, this insistence in like English, Spanish, Spanglish, right, and then there's like a tad bit of French, there's like a bit of native language from anyway, and so. But one of the other things I really wanted to, and then I really wanted to center Philadelphia kitchens. Like that was just like from the get. Like I wanted a song about the kitchens in Philadelphia. Find inspiration everywhere. But yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to do was, and I did on a different track that you heard I think a bit of, was there's so many drug songs disguised as love songs, right? So like I can't feel my face when I'm with you. But sorry, culture. And so I wanted a political song disguised as a love song, right? And so one of the things I do in one of the tracks is I sample Millie Jackson and All the Way Lover, right? And so I like try to construct this idea that all the Way Lover actually like thinks beyond the self, right? And thinks about everybody. And so and All the Way Lover loves till everyone gets to eat and everyone has a home and no one's on their own, right? And yeah, I can't remember my own lyrics, but it's because I have a crutch right here, and so I want to look at it. But yeah, and so I kind of go on that idea, and so it was like fun to sort of play with these like tropes or these ideas, and for me, you know, the initial thing was I was just listening to a lot of reggaeton, like I was just like that was the thing, and I was like, why? It's complicated, it's sexist, it's all the things, right? And but just you know how many people feel about rap music in general. And you know, it's especially Spanish rap, and there was a track in which a poet in Houston, we called it like a Latin trap, but there's nothing, Latin trap is just trap music, it's just in Spanish, right? And so like, there's nothing like inherently whatever, and so, but then he brings in Houston and brings in, you know, and he's a black man in Houston and very much aware of like a Latino Mexican culture in Houston, and so he brings those together in his vocals, and that felt really important, but like always sort of like playing with these sort of tropes of like, and I wanted to do I think a little bit more of it than I ended up doing in the end, right? And so and you can see it a little in the little visuals of me that are kind of playing with like reggaeton like ladies, right? And like sort of this like, but I couldn't quite do it, and that was originally gonna like I'm not right quite there. Those years have passed or something, I don't know, but like, and you know, in my career as a DJ, you know, this like sort of sexualization of the female DJ, right? Too. So like, and I was wanting to like flip it or play with it, and I didn't quite, and I ended up on, and I was also initially going to be like a cover image, because the covers are very much like just like, you know, very much like a rap cover, rap video sort of stereotype of like, just like woman body thing, and I just couldn't quite go there, but I think I'm still sort of like thinking about that, but I guess I wanted to sort of like reclaim or like politicize reggaeton in a way that it actually is, but not so overtly and only increasingly lately, right? Big Bunny is a huge reggaeton star, but he's like considered to be like really radical, but it's funny how like watered down that can be, right? It's like, oh, he paints his nails, like, you know, so it's like it's just not that like, and maybe it is valuable, right? And I also think a lot about having been a DJ and what will people dance to and what will people engage with, right? And trying to tap into that, I think a lot about accessibility, but not like watered down accessibility, right? Not like anti-intellectual accessibility, but like because people are looking for solace, right? And I think so often in politics, including, you know, my own life, it's just like what you're against, and so what are you for is I think an important question that people have long asked, and we have to keep remembering to ask, right? So that, I don't know, that's like sort of, that's why reggaeton, right? Because I'm for the dance party. And then Philly, you know, I was just at the Common Field asked me to write something too about that, of like why Philadelphia, and people were talking about earlier about like suicide of language or linguistic side. And, you know, I can't get around the fact that we actually are engaged in a collective suicide in terms of the earth, right? And so I wonder, you know, and again, I like say the thing and then I say the opposite. But I do sort of, like Philadelphia perhaps offers an alternative, but you know, what was it, 10 years ago, the New York Times claimed us as the 6th borough, right? So, like, and there's a ton of New York money in Philadelphia, a ton. And people commute. If you can get here in 45 minutes, if you can pay enough. It's faster than Brooklyn. And a lot faster if you ride the L train. Yeah, so I think it's tricky, but I think, you know, Philadelphia in that shadow does have a sort of unique, or has had a unique sort of perspective of sort of outsider kid brother thing that I think is useful, and affordability, which is shifting as well, and then, you know, and through that perhaps an opportunity, but it's also the you know, I also work at Community College of Philadelphia. It's the poorest big city in America, and it's definitely a tale of two cities, as to, you know, and I used to work with teens on probation, and I think I knew, and families involved with DHS, and I knew that even more so than I know now. I joke that, you know, now I work with a good cousin. But you know, with similar economic and class background and racial backgrounds as far as my students. And so I feel like they are very much left out of the new Philadelphia. So what, I guess it's like opportunity for who, right? And like what can Philadelphia be and for who, is always like the sort of question. Yeah, I think that was answering some of it.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions or comments?
Billy?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you've given us so much context as to how you thought through your process. Could you play us a little song or two?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I forget. You haven't heard it.
Yeah, we haven't heard it.
Yeah. Like this is what I played for here. This is the big dance track. So the tuba players. So tuba players, you know, when you put a call out for a tuba player, what you find out is tuba players are hungry. They don't get asked for much. And I say this like in a loving way. And so I didn't have a ton of money left over at this point in the project. And so it was kind of this negotiation where I'm like, I don't want to disrespect you, man, but like kind of what's your lowest like cost? And he's like, $50? And I'm like, $50? Yeah. So I guess he didn't think I got my $50 worth, because I sent him some tracks and he ended up being on those tracks. So we brought in some sounds to go with it, some whatever. And so, you know, we recorded live tuba in the studio. It was awesome. Most professional person probably that we worked with. I don't know, just classically trained tuba player. And then he was like, well, do you want anything else? And I was like, I mean, what do you got? You know. And so, because again, I joked that he didn't think I got my $50 worth or something. I was like, I'm fine, dude. And then I was like, okay, and I played him the song I'd been listening to on repeat, because it's sometimes how I do it. This reggaeton like hit, I don't even remember what it was. Oh, well, no, it was probably J Balvin. And I played it for him. I was like, can you make me a summer banger? Right? And he was like, okay. And he like listened, and so this is what he came up with, which you heard a little bit of, but you can hear the whole thing.
Trabajamos para la curación, entonces bailaba, baila con la gente, baila conmigo, baila con la gente, baila con la gente, baila con la gente. Common is different. Stop thinking you alone are better. Tenemos dos días de queso, creemos en nuestra posibilidad y en dignidad para todos. Baila conmigo, baila con la gente. 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 Al ritmo de la calle sucio, al ritmo de orgullo, al ritmo de la cocina y de justicia. Justicia más que una persona.
Anyways, you get the idea there. I try to make a pop song. It's really, really hard to make a pop song, even though there are very few lyrics involved. Anyway, sorry. I like analyzed pop songs in a whole new way. Like I knew it from a dance perspective and from a DJ perspective, and like appreciate a very basic song. But it's actually like to get a catchy hook that sticks in your brain, right? And that you're like walking around like, you know, like what is it that it's deceivingly difficult, and it's actually fascinating, but I think also sometimes people overwork it, and that's where it doesn't work. And so you kind of have to embrace like a sort of cheesiness, and like I think Cardi B is like a great example. Like God, somebody sing it. Come on, everybody knew it. I mean, there's just these songs that get into the sort of collective consciousness if you allow it. But yeah, and we were talking about this when we first met up, like the sort of collective consciousness or the collective conversation, right, of Game of Thrones, right? And like, you might not even want to be there, but you're like, I'm left out if I don't know. Like, and it's always fascinating to me when I meet somebody who doesn't know who Cardi B is. I'm like, ooh, what rock, right? And no offense to anybody who doesn't. Like, I just find that like interesting because, and maybe I'll get to the point where I don't. And there are things that my students know about, and I'm like, what? And it's confusing, but yeah. So that's one song. I think another one. So if we think about that love song, political song disguised as a love song.
When that love wheel starts a turning, we gotta ride it all the way.
It's still weird to hear my voice. That was probably the hardest part, because I'm not a singer. So what do you do?
Stay there till the job is done.
Ain't good enough. It's halfway loving, just don't get it.
Stay there till the job is done.
Good, just ain't good enough. It's halfway loving, just don't get it.
Stay there till the job is done.
An all-the-way lover loves till everyone gets to eat, and everyone has a home, and no one is on their own. Egos and guns are down, now laughter, music, next level sound. Bodies pressing in consent. Clear futurity where we went.
That might be the most academic line in the whole
And
thing.
no one
Frankly.
is on their own. Good. Ain't good enough. It's halfway loving, just don't get it. Good.
So yeah, so Millie Jackson means a whole different thing of staying there till the job is done than I meant, right? But I liked the playing with that. I think the sample really like allows for that, and that's like a lot of what we hear in music is like something to repurpose, right? Or given a new function, and the lyrics that meant one thing then become a whole different like hook or a whole different thing. And I just really love that about music and the manipulation that's possible. So definitely a huge part of what I was doing or trying to do.
Yeah, I think what this song and even the other Viva La Vida you really get is that like by politicizing these genres or these tropes, you're revealing the inherent like politics of the original, right? That also comes through baila conmigo, baila con la gente. Like, well, like baila con la gente always, right?
Right, and that's like yeah, it's a huge part of like, because like so many, and you know, not to diss folks who are doing a good job at it, but so many like political records actually kind of suck as records, right? Like, as somebody who tried really hard to DJ them, because I was DJing for like leftists and punks, I would be like, yeah, but nobody wants to hear that, right? Like, people want to hear the banger, right? Like, or whatever, and that's not always true, and I think it's a rare exception, and I'm not even sure I quite got where I wanted to go, but that was like, I was like, I want to do the thing that I want, right? Like, and this is why people write, like, why write a poem, why write a novel? Write the thing you want to read, right? Like, write the thing that adds to the conversation. Otherwise, I don't know, you're just getting tenure. But, you know, like, so, sorry, guys. You know, like, whatever, like, you know, so that was, like, kind of what, and that was the freedom of this project, is that it wasn't tied to my career in any way, right? Like, I am a DJ, but that's always been a way that I contribute to social justice. That's been a way that, like, you know, I DJ for, he's kind of famous if you guys keep up on criminal justice stuff, Krasner, the DA, District Attorney of Philadelphia. Like, so I was Krasner's DJ, which is like a weird world to be in at this point in my life, right? DJing for city council, like, folks, like, what is life, right? Like it's a real, like, it's a new cool, right? I'm gonna claim it, but, you know, so I don't know, so like, I've always been trying to interested in those things, but that's not like where, you know, where I get, I don't know, any sort of financial or whatever reward. I mean, it's been interesting also to have, like, to be invited here was like, I was like, oh, cool, what's life? You know, but, you know, and I think it is ultimately, like, because then I had to, like, while trying to do a sort of universal music-based audience, then it was a question of what actually is the audience, right? Like, I'm interested in that. This is something I want to listen to. I know some people who do as well. You know, going back to sort of your partner's like music world at RCA, right? Like, it's a very different thing, like what hits that market and like what makes those things happen. And I don't have any of that. I know you asked this in one of your questions. I don't have any of that machine behind this record, right? So like, and I hadn't really quite gotten, it was like, you know, because I work full time, I do a million things. It was like, finish the album, oh shit, this album's now taken a year. And I hadn't really gotten to stage 2 of like, oh, there's no promotions company. How do I get anybody to hear it, right? Because I just hadn't had time for that like sort of question and hadn't had any practice in that, you know, other than like sort of politics and whatever. And so trying to tap into sort of poetry world, you know, as like a published like writer. I went to school for fiction, but arguably I've been more successful as a poet and then nonfiction writer. So trying to like access those worlds, and then like academia has been really more curious, and then like the music world through like Josh and other music folks and producers, you know, like where is the home? And I think when you're between genres, right, and what I call like genre defiant, which I also think, you know, happens with identities, right, and we talked about that earlier as well, like, you know, there's like these there's these tropes and these stereotypes of what Latinx identity is, right? And when you don't fit into that, you can be a little confused, right? And I'm 40 now, so I don't give a fuck. But like, you know, when I was young and people were asking me, what are you? And it was very much about like your Spanish purity or not, you know, I was confused by that and not sure of how to identify and what that was. And knowing that like my story was outside of these stories that were like, you know, presented, which are very real and are very important, and I think should, in many ways, we could argue, come first. What I call like sort of tortilla literature, right? Like, but that's not everybody, you know, 50% of Latinos in the United States don't grow up speaking Spanish, right? Selena did not speak Spanish, right? Until she became a Spanish language star, right? And so I think that nuance and that complication is where I both like live and what I'm interested in. But I think it can be harder to find market or to have people find you as well when you're outside of those things, right? So, interesting stuff. So hi guys, you're it. Thank you for being here.
Well, unless anybody has, yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for sharing your heterogeneous experience.
Yeah.
It's really wide-ranging. Sorry, I used the word heterogeneous a little early. Actually, what I meant to say, sorry, losing my train of thought a little, but the experience you're sharing is actually enlightened me as to how heterogeneous DJing is. That's what I actually meant to say. Because, you know, there's the work you were doing, but then there's also the fact of, you know, someone like Diplo, for instance, right?
Who's from Philly?
And it's curious because DJ can be such a fascinating and contradiction on many levels, especially in regards to the issues you're trying to bring up. So much of the vitriol that we spew towards Mexican immigrants in this country has to do with something of U.S. policy specifically, which is NAFTA, right? But NAFTA is confusing because that was actually about borderlessness, but borderlessness in the sense that you're talking about New York money being in Philadelphia, like that kind of thing. And so there's the hyper liquidness and mobility of money, but not of people. And then there's the DJ, who is a kind of heroic, celebrated, liquid modern figure. And I mean, many of your films also are quite. I mean, they. I not to put them in a box at all, but there are some elements that seem to draw, or could be labeled as like a postmodern kind of thing. It's like the glitchiness and the collage, and then you know the postmodern aesthetic is really attached to a kind of late capitalist idea as well of the world. And so I guess just if you maybe I'm asking I don't know your thoughts on what the DJing world is like there. It's an ecosystem unto itself, and there's a lot of contradiction. There are questions about appropriation that happen within DJing. It almost seems as if you know we're just really lucky with you. You have a particular consciousness that is sending your searches into the archive and the way you're listening to the world and what you're putting together in a particular way. But there's nothing that would actually, like, there's nothing about music itself or DJing or those tools that are available that would actually determine that as the end goal. There are people who would be using it towards more purely club banger, get me to Lollapalooza kind of thing, right? So
yeah, like anything, right? Like crowd pleaser. I mean, I have like an unwritten essay called like about DJ theory, right? Right, and there's two different kinds of DJs, right? There's the DJ, and I think the original DJ would be like play new tracks that people hadn't heard, right? And would break new albums, right? I don't think that's what we often want, right? Then there's like the opposite end of the spectrum, maybe being the wedding DJ, which is just play the hits, right? Let everybody dance, grandma wants to dance too, right? And everybody knows the Cupid Shuffle. So, or the electric slide, right? And people wanting a certain thing and wanting it, and you know, and being a DJ and having people like talk to you like they just, you're working for them and they want to push play, right? And they want this one song that they want now, right? Like you're a glorified like jukebox, right? In some cases, right? And then also like with DJing, which I've thought about a lot, like. You know, there's like a selfish DJ that's like, ooh, look what I can do, and everybody's like, but I just want to dance, bitch, right? Like, and you can't, because they're like just showing off, right? And they're showing their like random knowledge, right? And so there's those DJs that you go to, and if you're a super record geek, you're like, whoa, check it out, but like you can't dance, right? But they're just like, look at, and often those DJs don't dance, which I find really interesting, right? Like they don't really have rhythm. It's fascinating. But anyway, But you know, and then there's DJs like me, and I was like a decent DJ or somebody that like many people or a certain number of people liked enough because I knew what people wanted to hear, and I was not like, and so there's like the selfish DJ, there's the generous DJ, and I would play a song through because I knew people like really wanted to hear it, and also there's a comfort level where people want to dance to things they know, right? And we also see that in contemporary American like narratives, like people want the familiar, right? And people are scared of the unknown, right? And so maybe we just need more DJs that push other narratives, push other sounds, right? Like in like a theoretical, like woo-woo way. So you know, there's like the DJ is like, it's like fascinating, and it's also, are you an artist, right? And I too have that question, right? I mean, I'm not for this. I actually feel fine about this as art. But when I'm DJing at like an event, like I'm really just playing other people's stuff, and like there's some curatorial aspect to it, right? And sometimes when you're like remixing or sampling or like manipulating something or playing doubles, you are making a new song, right? But where are those lines of sort of artistic, you know, and art is what you get away with, and like everything's a remix and everything's cited and everything can't, you know, every song's already been sung with it. Who would have, you know, all the quotes, right? We're all just useless. But like, you know, so you know, anyway, but I find like the remix to be really honest, right? In its way, right? And sort of in a sample, to be really honest. At the same time, like I didn't pay for anything, and you know I shouted out, but like you know, you can hear most of the record on Spotify. But there's 3 tracks that I knew Spotify's algorithm would say no to, right? Because I don't have permissions for Millie Jackson, I don't have permissions for Toto, and I forget the other really blatant sample. I don't remember. So there were like 3 songs that I was like, there's no way this can get through Spotify's algorithm, but everything else did, right? Because so then there's also like the who's judging, right? And so when the algorithm, when the computer says, oh, it's passable, right? Then it can be on there unless somebody were to, right? You guys talked about this too, of like translation, right? The human element would be like, oh no, I hear this thing that the computer doesn't hear, right? And then you would have to pay for it. So if any of these songs like blew up, which they won't, but like if any of them did, there would be like a price to pay, right? There would be a lawsuit, like there would be something. But I'm actually just not like, you know, no borders, no rules. So like, I just didn't like really worry about it too much because of this sort of art project. And then, you know, there are the legalities of like what's like of art and sampling and like whatever too. I mean, I think you could have an interesting gray area there legally, but maybe not. I don't know, so that, I ramble and I lose there as well.
Yeah, just as you were speaking, it just struck me. It's the you know, with globalization specifically and free trade laws, it's just like we presume the mobility of populations. We tack onto it, you know, of course, ideologies of like opportunity, whatever. But then there's also the DJ who is actually practicing and celebrated for being, you know, able to travel everywhere, be rootless. The rootlessness is celebrated in one context. It's a huge source of trauma in the other.
Yes.
And so I was just thinking, like,
and that's absolutely tied to capital and who can afford to party in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
You know, absolutely, yeah. No, it's super, super complicated, and DJs are often like kind of shitty people, but you know, but then also not like, but they're also just super geeks for music at their best, right? And they're like really like one world, we're all in it together, you know, because like they kind of can't separate out cultures at that point a little. I mean, they can, but they're not that interested in it, which I find really lovely at its best. But yeah, at its worst is like, yeah, just like colonial and sad. It's not a note to end on. Somebody say something.